dealing with the rotation of the planet. Because you have to sort of imagine that there's these large collection of rocks that are sort of floating together in space, and we call them home, or Earth, and that on these rocks are the continents that we scurry around on. But that the rocks themselves, the giant tectonic plates, really are basically, they're not all that solid. Want to move relative to each other based on all kinds of influences from gravity, pressure, magnetism, and all this sort of a deal. And it appears as though the Australian plate is attempting to separate itself from the edge where it connects to the Pacific plate. We can look at it two ways. We can buy into the subduction theory that the Australian plate's trying to dive under the Pacific because the Pacific is larger, in spite of the fact of relative height differentials and all these other things. I just don't buy subduction for a number of different reasons. But it actually does appear, though, that what's going on here is an indicator that there is larger issues that are going to be evolving on the planet relative to the rotation. Because if you get a globe and you start looking at where the earthquakes are appearing and the impacts we're seeing with, for instance, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the recent volcano activity in the Caribbean, the volcano activity around the Ring of Fire in the eastern edge of China and Russia, then you get an idea that basically we may be looking at the early stage of some planet-wide stresses that are being exhibited because something's going on relative to the rotation of the Earth.
Interesting.
And if I'm correct about this, then the patterns, this is the theory part. Theories are really good. You can say, okay, this idea fits the following facts, and if it's correct, we can make some predictions that can be checked out. If I'm correct, then we'll get to a period where the earthquakes will increase, and we'll start seeing them spread to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and some of the other areas in the Pacific, notably along the western edge of South America in that part of the Cordillera, and then also in the southern area around Africa, where Africa's plate heads over towards our crack in 90 East. And that there, in fact, may be new lands that will form in the 90 East area. Because it's so unpopulated in that area, I don't know that anybody would pay attention for a long time. You could probably have several small islands show up, and maybe no one would really notice.
Huh.
But nonetheless, we should see these impacts start to cause problems in the Atlantic. I would suspect over the course of winter and into early spring, and then another large increase again. Oh, and a further subset of all of this, by the way, is that all this appears to be related to the solstice and the equinox, because of the pattern of the earthquakes appearing, the larger earthquakes appearing relative to our indicators around the solstice this year, June 21. So in our predictive language, which is done on a lunar calendar, also seem to associate a lot of the coming earthquakes around solstice and equinox clusters, if you will, and then a slight fade down and then ramping back up, as though the precession of the equinox, again, an indicator of rotation issues. So we may be actually looking at some indicators that there's a pole flip on the way.
And what does that look like to you? A pole flip?
Well, it looks like maybe if we're lucky, there might be a couple of million people survive as breeding pairs. The species may survive.
Okay.
A crustal shift of any size is catastrophic. There's no indication anywhere that crustal shifts have ever been less than 30 degrees. So I imagine it's probably much worse than Hollywood is able to conjure up with their 2012 movie, although I'm sure they did a real good job in making it as scary as possible.
Well, yeah, and actually, interestingly enough, somebody actually asked that question if you had actually seen the trailer for the upcoming movie 2012. No,
the only thing I'd ever seen was the one where they had a few months back or a year back, where they had the wave coming over the Himalayas, and I just saw that little 20-second blip of it.
Ah, okay. Well, and I've been seeing some clips of it. It certainly is not a pleasant movie. And of course, I'm not one of those people that really think that all of this has to be quite as devastating as it is. Call me whatever you want, but that's just.
There's some real problems here, and the real problem is the strange way in which our species is. I mean, the reality is that we're a species with amnesia, that there's indicators that we've been on this planet for millions of years. If you take into account all these, quote, out-of-place artifacts, and you ignore the constraints placed on you by modern academia, then you understand that humans are at least several millions of years old. And why should we not remember our history? Our history should be, ancient and grand, not this puny little 4,000 or 5,000 year kind of meandering back to some level of civilization. And since we have the indications that there's previous civilizations that seem to be destroyed repeatedly, I take very seriously those few scraps that come through. Some of the scraps, for instance, include this thing called the Narmer plate, which is what the people that used to live in Egypt before the Egyptian state emerged, the pharaohs at all, but the people that were before that called their area Narmer, and it may have been how the Atlanteans thought of themselves to a certain extent. But in any event, the Narmer plate talks about the 12 cycles and the 11 previous cycles that basically occur every about 10,000 years or 11,000 years on the mean, and cause disruption in the social order here on the planet, and then we try and rebuild desperately before it happens to us all over again. So I seeing the out-of-place artifacts and the strange things that are occurring with the planet now, it's like, oh yeah, this all kind of makes sense, that indeed I think we're at one of those strange periods of planetary history. And then also on a curious note, I mean, I don't have prophetic dreams or any of that. In fact, I don't dream at all, or haven't really had any memorable dreams for perhaps 20-plus years. But I did have a period where I had a dream for 10 solid years. And it was basically the same dream over and over and over again. And it had very little variation. It occurred almost daily, certainly multiple times a week. And it was involving getting into a kayak and paddling in horrific rains in a wetsuit, kind of a kayaking suit, across a flooded city, which is the city I live in, to the Washington State Library, where I would tie my kayak up in this hole that had been created in the third floor wall. Now, the curious part of the dream was then I spent all the dream working, and in working, what we were doing was dipping books in, wrapping them up in paper and dipping them in wax, and then sealing the wax in plastic, and then sealing and sealing and sealing until basically what was started off as a little book ended up something the size of a small car. And the idea was to try and preserve knowledge, obviously, at the archetype level within the dream. The curious part of it all was that the dream stopped when I went to work for the State Library in clerical function in 1983. So and actually saw the facility and saw the wall where ultimately the hole would be under these particular circumstances. And if that were the case, then that would imply probably at least 180, maybe 200 plus feet of water in order to cause the third floor to be the point of entrance into the multi-story State Library building here. But again, what makes it curious, and I didn't know it at the time I was having the dreams, I knew about the State Library in general, had used it once or twice while I was having the dreams, but really didn't pay much attention to it until about a year before I went to work there, and then I started using the facilities extensively, and discovered it's one of the 16 federal repositories where they put all these federal documents, just in case of nuclear war kind of an issue. So it was just a strange little set of circumstances, and now I find myself here multiple decades later contemplating a reality that may bring something close to that, at least at the archetype level. The need to preserve knowledge because of catastrophic level, waterborne perhaps, climate change.
Interesting. Well, as you know, as we're communicating on that level, as far as that whole particular scenario is concerned, I think, first of all, let me back up and just say I think that's pretty interesting about your dream, and especially in the times, because we've had this conversation about the artifacts, and we're discovering them all over the place now. That's kind of where I kind of want to take this, but I think that's interesting that you shared that with us. Thank you for that, because that's a personal bit of information, but I think it's very, very important. What in the reports is also talking about, because we had in your reports from before, you had this some kind of an artifact or some kind of device that was being carried around.
Yes.
And then you've also talked about, separately, different than that, you've also talked about some of the artifacts or discoveries, ancient discoveries as well, that would also be kind of playing into this mix. So I'm, if you could, just one of those threads or the other. And
sure. Well, actually, they're both sort of semi-connected. The device apparently that is forecast to pop up is going to have some level of its visibility begin to rise in this November, and it should become, to the aware observer, we should be able to see who are two liberators or thieves or travelers or however we want to think about them. These people should be primarily visible to us by March of next year, and we should have some knowledge of the device being either recovered or find out what's occurred with it. But we'll have to look through the chaos that is going to have a tendency to provide a whole lot of different things to distract